Welcome to the Patriot Perspective. My name is Gregory Lykov, and I'm joined here with my co-host Ofer Adar.
Hello, everybody. Today is the 30th of October. A lot to get into today. We're going to begin by looking at the agreements made during Trump's 5-day Asia tour: South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, China. So much to get into over there. In Sudan, the mainstream media is completely ignoring the story. We need to give it more attention. There is so much bloodshed over there, and it really does deserve attention. So we'll look at that. There are discussions now due to the interest rates being cut by 25 basis points. And if we have time, we'll also discuss birthright citizenship. So a lot to get into today, Greg. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. So just to start off, how incredible was that trip to Asia that Trump had? He has
Yeah.
accomplished so much, whether it's dancing in front of the South Korean army or, landing in, different regions of the world and just being praised as a king basically there. These No Kings protests, they have a reason to protest Donald Trump because Asia is clearly scared of him. We saw just yesterday in the meeting between the Chinese president and Donald Trump himself, we saw a lot of concessions being made. Chuck Schumer, the first thing he posts about it is that Trump's ceded to the Chinese president, but obviously, after looking at what those concessions actually were and the deal made with China, it looks pretty promising. It looks, to my understanding, that we are going to get a much better situation in the rare earth minerals that China produces, which the United States heavily relies on in exchange for those tariffs that were set forth for, I believe it was November 1st, not to kick in. And those would be a full embargo tariff to the extent it was literally 100% on top of the 30% tariff China currently has. So it was pretty big. I'm pretty surprised. I didn't expect this concession to be made, but Ofer, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it does make sense when you think about it because, as you said, in effect, the tariffs that would have come November would have essentially been an embargo unless you're looking at an industry that China has a monopoly over. And so both sides, even though they don't want to say it publicly, they were both looking for a way to just return to the status quo before these changes were implemented. And so that's really what happened. We're talking about a truce-like scenario, meaning that China, they recently implemented those export controls on 5 new rare earth minerals. There were 17. 7 of them already had these new regulations going back to the beginning of the year, and they added in 5 more, which is crazy when you think about it, because China, they're the ones that process 90% of these rare earth minerals. In the US, they export 70% of them from China originally. And so you're now looking at 5 that no longer have regulations. So that's a big win for the United States. And in return, the United States is also dropping their retaliatory measures because they passed a rule. We talked about it in one of our earlier episodes that essentially said that any subsidiary of a major Chinese company that was blacklisted, like Huawei, for instance, they would be banned from doing business in the US. So now that rule is also gone. So both sides just returned to what the situation was looking like a month ago or a month and a half ago. And also, they agreed on a couple other things that are very important. So there was a fentanyl tariff of 20%, and this was essentially on like companies that their compounds are the ones that essentially are the originators of fentanyl and then make it to the United States and kill people. So now the tariffs on that went from 20% to 10%. And so the effective tariff, when you do the averages on all the industries, it went from 57% on China to 47%. That is what Trump said. And when we could look at what was pledged to occur if nothing would have been agreed upon at this entire situation in South Korea, then the tariffs would have reached 130%, as you mentioned. And so now that's been completely reverted, and the factual tariff that we already had in place is also being reduced by 10%. So
Yeah.
it's going to be good for the trade volume. And the final thing that is important to mention is that China, they pledged to buy additional amounts of soybeans, corn, and other farm products from the US. And it's estimated to bring in between 10 to $15 billion annually in for the agricultural industry. So that's good for the American farmers. They've been really biting their teeth to see what ends up happening because their bottom line is greatly affected by what China does. And they want to bring in now a lot of external products because of their grain shortages. So yeah, it's a good win-win situation for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. And that is pretty amazing. I actually didn't hear about the soybean farmers and the corn farmers getting that deal with China. That is huge because China obviously is a huge market. So it's very important that now they are actually going to be buying American product. But I wanted to, circle back to this idea of rare earth minerals and just how dependent the United States is on China for rare earth minerals. I mean, 70% of all rare earth minerals, I believe, globally are produced by China, and specifically in the United States, we are, only really buying from China, and this kind of is obviously, you know, detrimental to our advancement as a country because we can't be reliant on another country. That's why I want to see more effort taken to make sure that we're independent in our rare earth mineral extraction. I know Trump is doing a lot with Venezuela, which actually does have rare earth minerals, obviously, and oil, and maybe we will see something there. But definitely South America, which is a huge place with massive reservoirs of different rare earth minerals. I want to see him take more action there, and he is, which is good. But also, I wanted to bring into picture that China in general has a labor force that is actually very interesting because they use a lot of laborers aside from just the traditional workers. They use a lot of slave labor too, specifically the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are a Muslim Turkic group in China that lives in a certain region where basically they are taken from their homes. They are sent into re-education camps, concentration camps, and they're actually being forced to work, whether it's in rare earth mineral extraction or any other industry in China. And this is a way for China to also economically put itself up on the global scale because it gives them an advantage that no one else has. No one else in the world really is supposed to, be engaging in slave labor, but China is. So maybe I think interesting thing to do would be if Trump could take tariffs to implement them against this labor system, because it would be from a humanitarian standpoint, everyone would have to agree with it, and obviously from an economic standpoint, it would take this advantage that China has and turn it into a disadvantage. So maybe that's something worth exploring. But yeah, I just thought I would bring that up. But now on our next issue, which is really the main meat of this podcast, it's what is going on in Sudan. I mean, I'm sure our viewers have seen the videos. It is absolutely traumatic. It is horrible. It's tragic. And just from the standpoint of someone who lives in a major U.S. city, I mean, I haven't been seeing any protests, for the people in Sudan. So, Ofer, what are your thoughts? I mean, give me a little bit of a rundown of what's going on in Sudan, how it all started, and the reaction to it in the Western world.
Yeah, so the problem is there isn't much of a reaction, and there has to be because you're looking at a civil war that's been raging on now for 2 years. The problem is it goes back to the history of the conflict. You can look back decades, but the most recent increase in turmoil has been something that's occurred 2 years ago and has continued ever since. 150,000 people have died during this 2 year time period, and 12 million people have been displaced. So we're looking at what's happened here is that there was like a 30 plus year dictatorship by this individual called Omar al Bashir. He was a dictator, and what he did in order to concentrate power was bring in all these various proxies that had select proportional amounts of power. And that way they would sort of rival one another and they would never rival him. And he was fighting in South Sudan. Eventually, he lost that war in South Sudan, gained independence, and he was also fighting in Western Sudan in the Darfur region, which is majority Arab. As we know, Sudan is mostly Arab, but there's also a significant Black African population, sub-Saharan Africa in this case, and they're also predominantly Christian when you look at some of those tribes. So those Western African tribes, and I'm talking about the ones in the Darfur region, they were under a genocide in 2003. They were targeted by something called the Janjaweed militia, which is this militia of these Arab tribesmen that were supported by the Sudanese government. And over time, they built up a parallel military structure called initially the Janjaweed militia and then the Rapid Support Forces. And they were led by this guy, and they still are led by this guy called Mohammed Dagalo. And he became very important to the story. And at the same time, they were promoting through the ranks this commander called Burkhan, and he eventually became the leader of the Sudanese armed forces. So you have these two important characters, and due to these protests against the dictatorship, they realized that, Omar al-Bashir, the dictator, he's probably going to lose power and he's not popular anymore. So they overthrow him. They create a power sharing agreement. And then they agree with the protesters, the civilian pro-democracy protesters, to transition the government away from being controlled by the military. But that never happens. The deal falls through, and then there's a new deal signed in 2021. But That also fails. By the three, there's supposed to be a new round of negotiations, but it ends up failing because the RSF, led by Dagalo in this case, he did not want to integrate into the Sudanese military. And so a civil war breaks out between the two of them. They used to be allies, but now they're essentially enemies and they're fighting over the country. And the Sudanese government, which is led by the army now and by Burhan, they control most of Sudan. They captured the capital a couple of months ago, so they control northern Sudan, central Sudan. Western Sudan, though, is controlled by the RSF, and they are the ones that are committing these massacres that we saw over the past couple of days. They committed a massacre in a city called Al Fashir. It's the final stronghold of the Sudanese military within Darfur, and it's now been taken over by the RSF. So during the past couple of days, they've massacred over 2,000 people. And one of the commanders of the RSF, he's called Abu Lulu. He even admitted this on camera, and he was just ecstatic about it. Extrajudicial killing, sexual violence, going from door to door, killing people, and doing it indiscriminately. But there is a discriminate nature because there were specific targetings of Christians. Now, they were not the majority of the people killed, but yes, there was a specific targeting and attack put behind their backs due to their identity, and also as a whole against all the Arab tribesmen, or rather the African tribesmen. So the videos coming out are just absolutely gruesome, and there is no condemnation from the worldwide community. There is no action being taken, at least in a mainstream sense. There's obviously all the players involved that are supporting either side, and we could get into that later. But in terms of just the mainstream sentiments, we're just not seeing any of it, even though there was an active massacre going on in the city that was just taken over by the RSF, where you have 300,000 people that were stuck and lacked access to any sort of basic remedies. And now they're under the control of a regime that, is very hostile to minorities or to groups that are different than them, and has already proven that they are genocidal in their nature. And so, yeah, we have to just be speaking out, giving way more awareness to the situation, and hoping that the U.S. can try to broker a ceasefire between these two groups.
Yeah, definitely. And again, just adding on to your point, I mean, there's a lot of extra international involvement in this conflict that a lot of people aren't talking about. For example, we were talking earlier about the UAE's involvement in the conflict, and really they're the ones that are sponsoring these militias to take over and destroy, kill innocent people. So that is pretty crazy. But something that I found also to be very interesting in my research today is that there have been reports that weapons from the UK have actually been used in some of these attacks, and the UK doesn't deny it. They say that this was a small amount, but it's something to look at. It's something, I don't believe the UK has any part of this, but maybe the UK sold weapons into the UAE, and these weapons ended up in Sudan. So all of this is important to look at, but definitely the situation overall is just tragic. It's horrible what is going on in Sudan, and it's really just it shows a lot how people are not talking about this on college campuses anywhere. I mean, the situation in Sudan right now is 100 times worse than the situation was in Gaza, and for some reason the situation in Gaza got much more publicity, and I will leave it up to you on why that is. But yeah, I mean, definitely it's important to mention also that Africa, in other parts of Africa, there have been a recent uptick in fighting between different ethnic groups. For example, in Nigeria, we have seen a uptick in fighting between the Christian and Muslim minority groups in the north of Nigeria. And I mean, Nigeria has a huge history of this fighting, but just now it's being more publicized, I guess. But definitely, I think in order to end this, the only way to end this is by, making sure that the Western world is focused on it. I think the Western world has forgotten about Africa and about, in general, the horrible atrocities that have been going on. And this definitely doesn't fit the narrative that the much of the West is trying to push, where, this Muslim group is taking over and killing Christians. That does not fit the narrative at all. But I mean, what are your thoughts? And I wanted to add, we saw a situation in South Africa is also pretty similar, where we see that there is a genocide that half of the world is kind of denying the killing of Afrikaners, and Trump has been criticized for giving them refugee status in the United States, which I find crazy. But again, Ofer, what are your thoughts in general of this uptick in violence? I mean, we have seen in general Africa is a place where a lot of religious wars happen, and in general, between Muslim and Christians, it's a place where this happens all the time. But like, is now a particular time where it's extra bad, or what is the reasoning behind that?
It is sort of bad in relation to what it was over the past couple of years. There was a period like in the beginning of the 2010s where it was worse because you had the Arab Spring, and you also had the rise of Boko Haram at the time. Boko Haram is still very active now, like you mentioned, in Nigeria, by the way. They're conducting hundreds of raids against Christian villages in northern Nigeria, where the Christians are a minority. Because as we know, southern Nigeria is relatively Christian, and it's where you have the ethnic Yoruba and Igbos. And then in the northern part of Nigeria, that's where you have ethnic Fulanis and Hausas. The Fulanis, a lot of them are like these herders, and like they commit a lot of massacres as well. And it's also some of them jihadis that are from Boko Haram. In any case, though, it is higher now than it was before. And that's because of very specific conflicts that are beginning to flare up again, whether it be in Nigeria, which is still not as bad as it could be. It's not even close to where it used to be in terms of its apex. What's going on now in Sudan is actually really bad in comparison to previous years. So that's a new low. Libya is an area where there's a civil war, but it is pretty low lying right now. And by the way, the Haftar government, they're also allied with the RSF in Sudan. So you can see how everything sort of interconnects. And the RSF, they used to fight against the Houthis in Yemen back in 2015 with the UAE. So like there was a very complicated web of forces that are all operating with one another over here. But in any case, you bring up South Africa. That's an area where it could get worse. That's what I'm trying to really hone in on here. There's potential for things to actually further deteriorate if there isn't attention brought up. And this is where the international community and, just people speaking up can actually have some sort of difference. And we've seen that utilized in so many other places, like you mentioned in Gaza, where the grassroots mobilization effort was like huge in order to fight against that conflict. And so in South Africa, right now there's a 7,500 man cap on refugees coming into the US each year. And the majority of the refugees coming in, they're going to be South African Afrikaners. And I think that's amazing because, even though it's not as bad as it could be because there's not a state sanctioned group that is going out killing Afrikaners, what's going on, though, is that the government is turning a blind eye to criminals that are going specifically to target their land and raping women, destroying their houses, setting things on fire, and then killing individuals in their households. And that's going on, and there's no retribution. There's no law enforcement in these countries. There's complete anarchy and chaos in South Africa, in the countryside. And so, it's reaching a point where it could get worse. And the worst part is if the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is this left-wing radical Marxist party in South Africa, gets into power, they're going to push further with this land expropriation deal where they take the land of Afrikaners and white people, and they don't even give them compensation for it. So that's just complete discrimination. It's unjustified. And they also call for violence in their rallies. They say, kill the Boer. They call it a traditional South African song. So what does that tell you about traditional South African culture and what they're okay doing? So, I'm very worried about that. And I'm happy that the U.S. is actually standing up because, we have a cultural affinity with Afrikaners because of their European heritage, with their Dutch heritage as well. And the fact that they do have this work ethic that's very similar to the American culture and work ethic that we've known. It's very similar, and it's good that we're standing up in solidarity with them.
Yeah, of course. And just to kind of add on to your point, I mean, it's not that the reason, like the media has been claiming, the left-wing media has been claiming the reason why Trump is particularly giving refugee status to these Afrikaners is because they're white. That is not true. It's just because their values are much more aligned to Americans than other groups. I mean, they're not terrorists. They're good people that are hardworking. They're a lot in agriculture. They could help the United States greatly. It will will greatly benefit the United States if we get more of these type of people in. And I mean, at the end of the day, the American culture, which is a culture based off hard work, based off an ethic of resilience, and just continuing to go and go and go, and not expecting the government to give you free handouts. I mean, that is a culture that we want the people who come to the United States and immigrate to the United States to have. So it's not a bad thing to give priority to those people. It's a good thing, because those people are actually going to make our country better, and that's what Trump is doing. And I wanted to go back also to another point you have about Turkey. Turkey has been involved indirectly with the situation in Sudan for quite some time now, and in general, obviously, Turkey's a NATO ally. So, like, what does this is this a NATO issue? Could the situation in Sudan actually turn into a NATO issue if Turkey continues to openly support the groups in Sudan? Of course, it's not to the extent, they're not publicly supporting them, but it's clear through exchange routes that money that Turkey is sending is going to Sudan.
Yeah. The thing is, first of all, yeah, there is this fungibility because, it goes from one place to the other, and then it could end up in Sudan. By the way, the same thing happens with Russian weapons and Chinese weapons. Like, they've also ended up in the hands of the RSF, but at least in China's case, they're not directly supporting them. It's just that China sends weapons, and they have been for the past 50, 60 years, to these African countries, and then they end up somehow rolling over into their hands. And that's a big problem because in Sudan, there's a massive arms export industry. They're making so much money off of just selling weapons everywhere and buying them as well. And you mentioned the UAE, and that's also a major non-NATO ally that the United States is trying to build closer relationships with. They are working and they're in cahoots with the leader of the RSF because he is in control of this massive gold mine magnate within the country. He's become one of the richest men in all of Africa, and he's using that to help enrich and create business dealings with UAE. So it's transactional for everybody, for Turkey, for UAE, for the Russians, because the Wagner Group was also involved with the RSF before Prigozhin died, and recently they've sort of scaled back that support for them, and the Russian government has a more neutral stance on the situation. But yeah, all around, it's complicated, and because it's in Africa and NATO is more so dealing with the borders of European countries, then they've usually refrained from taking direct action to intervene with each state's involvement in proxy wars. But if you remember, the intervention in Libya was led by NATO. NATO led that intervention collectively to topple Gaddafi. So they have a history in some cases of intervening in areas that aren't even in Europe if they think it's going to benefit their interests.
Yeah, definitely. And, now just to move on from that topic, which is a little bit difficult. I mean, again, the situation in Sudan is only going to get worse, at least from what we have seen. And just the lack of attention on this issue is ridiculous. I mean, I want to see significantly more attention, and hopefully the Trump administration will be taking action there. I know he does have leverage there, so we'll see. But, our final topic today will be discussing the birthright citizenship situation right now, if I'm not mistaken. The birthright citizenship situation right now in the United States. So there has been a lot of talk about whether the Supreme Court is going to uphold Trump's decision or Trump's executive order that basically says that if you are an illegal immigrant and you have a child born here, you are not going to have citizenship. There's a lot of opinions on this. I mean, a lot of people think that birthright citizenship should be given to all illegal immigrants, and a lot of people think otherwise. But really, it all comes down to the definition of subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That is what a lot of people have conceded. And, that definition will depend on how the Supreme Court will rule in the case of birthright citizenship. But Ofer, why don't you just give me your thoughts, a little bit of a rundown, what you think would be the correct ruling here?
Probably based on the plain text of the 14th Amendment, it would be to repeal what Trump said. And I don't like that because I would prefer to live in a world where we don't have birthright citizenship. But that's just if you're taking a modern day interpretation and just doing it word for word without considering the context of where the 14th Amendment is ratified, then yeah, it doesn't have any legal standing. But let's say you go back to the context, which was to give citizenship and equal rights to freed slaves, then that has a completely different context compared to what we're seeing today. And so that was what I would try to argue. I would try to go back to the people who actually wrote the 14th Amendment and their entire discussion about the situation, and also the way in which they talked about Native Americans who were born here and did not receive citizenship up until later, because that can also be used as proof that perhaps it wasn't all encompassing, that it only talked about a specific group, those being freed African slaves who were, of course, born within the territories of the U.S., were not considered full citizens up until that was, of course, made very clear with the amendments that were passed during the Reconstruction era. So that would be my line of argumentation, and I think that's the most realistic, if you were to go into the brains of the people who wrote it.
Yeah, definitely. And I pretty much agree with you. I think that it really depends on how you interpret the Constitution, whether it's going to be through a originalist or through a living constitutionalist perspective. But I actually wrote a few articles on this exact issue. And in one of them, I describe that it's important to look at the actual framers of the 14th Amendment. And the person who wrote the birthright citizenship clause in the 14th Amendment was Senator Jacob Howard of Michigan, who was a senator at the time who drafted the citizenship clause and ratified it, or got it to become ratified. And he even said himself, and I'm going to quote him right now, "Foreigners, aliens, or families of ambassadors would not be included in the citizenship clause." So it's very clear that he meant to specify the citizenship clause to freed slaves. It's not meant for anyone else. He even uses the term aliens. And of course, now the Supreme Court has held that if you are a foreigner and you are in the United States legally, then you still get birthright citizenship. However, the Supreme Court never ruled on, obviously, if you're an illegal foreigner in the United States. So it's going to be interesting to see. I personally think that the Supreme Court will not uphold Donald Trump's executive order. However, I do think that they will give Congress the decision to decide what subject to the jurisdiction thereof means. And the reason I say that is because in the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, which is another part of it, it literally says that Congress shall enforce these laws, or Congress shall enforce these provisions. So it is up to Congress to decide. Hopefully that's what the court rules. But again, we can never be too sure. I mean, it's a little bit of a wishy-washy case here, and it's not very clear. But I am not a fan in general of Trump's executive order, just because I don't think the president has the power to do that. I think Congress has the power to do that. And if the Supreme Court rules in favor of giving Congress the ability to exercise or to end birthright citizenship, then Congress should take action.
Yeah, and that's probably the most likely scenario in terms of how it's going to play out in the Supreme Courts. But yeah, in terms of like our own ideal view of how things would be, I would definitely emulate the European model in my ideal vision. I would just ensure that, there's no sort of phenomenon like an anchor baby, that people can't come in illegally or come in through temporary visas and then give birth to a child in voila, now they're able to stay here forever in perpetuity, and they get SNAP benefits, and then they get to complain about not getting them when the government shuts down. Like, you see how many things end up happening and end up becoming exponentially more harmful due to one decision related to birthright citizenship, because that also entails all the benefits of being a citizen as well. And that also harms the, pockets of the United States and all the taxpayers. Yeah. So I'm completely against it. And yeah, I hope that, Trump doing that executive order at least pushes it forward in a direction that is way more in favor of, rethinking our model for the past 100 years with our immigration system.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think this is one of the biggest issues right now, because it's really a question of precedent and how we're going to move forward if, a Republican isn't going to be elected in, 10 years. So we'll see, but definitely interesting to look at. And thank you guys for joining us on this short episode of The Patriot Perspective. We will be back on it tomorrow. And yes, thank you guys for joining.
Thank you guys.